Thanks for joining us for this archive of Teaching American History's Documents in Detail webinar for Wednesday, November 17th, 2021. We focused on a document from our Core Documents volume on gender and equality today. It was Judith Sargent Murray's 1790 On the Equality of the Sexes essay. We were joined by Dr. David Krugler of the University of Wisconsin-Platteville as our moderator, Dr. Sarah Morgan Smith, the editor of the Gender and Equality volume, and Dr. Cara Rogers of Ashland University.
Well, welcome all to this, our fourth episode, the fourth of 10 in this academic year's Document in Details series, which is sponsored by teachingamericanhistory.org. This series features can't miss documents from our ongoing core documents collection. And I'm excited tonight to be the host for a selection from the Gender and Equality Core Documents collection. Those of you who participate in these monthly webinars regularly know that I am not Dr. John Moser. My name is Dr. David Krugler, and I am substituting for Dr. Moser tonight. It's my pleasure to be the introducer and the poser of questions for our distinguished scholars tonight, Dr. Sarah Morgan Smith and Dr. Cara Rogers. I will give an introduction to both in a moment. I do want to just offer an overview of the purpose of the documents in details for those of you who are joining us for the first time. They offer a close read and an in-depth discussion of a single document. We devote the hour to just that document. Our featured scholars discuss the ideas, the historical context, the audience, and a host of other factors related to this document. This is all to help you, the teachers, gain a better and deeper understanding of just one core document in U.S. history. We do take questions, and I'll be monitoring the Q&A feature of Zoom to bring these questions up to Drs. Rogers and Smith. The chat will not be used, so please use Q&A to pose your questions. With that said, let me offer introductions, and then I'll start posing questions to Cara and Sarah, and as they answer, we'll look for questions from you all in the Q&A. Before I forget, I also want to let you know that next month's document deal will take place on Wednesday, November 15th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and it will feature Dr. Joe Forneri, the editor of the Free Speech Core Documents collection. So that will be very interesting. Joe will have a lot to say, I'm sure, about that collection which he edited. Dr. Sarah Morgan Smith is an early graduate of the MAG program, which is offered through Ashland University through the Ashbrook Center, completing her master's in 2009. She then completed a PhD in early American history at Rutgers University. And she is the co-editor of the very first collection in this series, Religion in American History and Politics, which appeared in 2016. She is also the editor of the collection we're highlighting tonight, Gender and Equality Core Documents. She's a specialist on religion in America and on the early republic, including the very important topic of Republican motherhood. Joining Dr. Smith is Dr. Cara Rogers, who is an associate professor at Ashland University in the Department of History and Political Science. She completed her PhD at Rice University in Texas. At Ashland, she teaches classes on colonial U.S. history, the Enlightenment, and also Thomas Jefferson. She's a specialist on Thomas Jefferson. And Cara, I see you have a recent article, or will very soon have an article in the prestigious journal, the Journal of Southern History, a reconsideration of the notes on the state of Virginia. So if that's not out, we certainly look forward to reading it in an upcoming issue of the Journal of Southern History. So our focus tonight is on this wonderful and engaging piece published pseudonymously by Judith Sargent Murray in March of 1790. But she actually wrote it 10 years earlier when she was in her late 20s on the equality of the sexes. Cara and Sarah, could I ask you to tell us a little bit more about the provenance of this piece, how Murray came to write it, why she withheld it from publication for more than 10 years, what prompted her to put it forward to the Massachusetts Magazine?
Sarah, I'm going to let you take a stab at this one first.
Okay, sure. So one of the things that's really fascinating about Judith Sargent Murray is that she is at one and the same time an incredibly independent-minded woman, an incredibly determined self-promoter. In her private circles, she spends a lot of time sort of sending her work around and asking people to read drafts of things. And then, later in life, when she collects her writings to publish them in what turns out to be a 3-volume set, she actually does all the work of getting subscribers to offset the cost up front. So she's really bold. But she's also very concerned about looking brash and looking to be unwomanly, or as if she's stepping out of the appropriate space for a woman. And so I think part of the reason that it is not published until so much later is her own sort of internal tension between those two things, right? And especially because in her early 20s, she gets married to John Stevens, a local merchant, who it turns out she's actually not as compatible with as she thought. And so she's not very happy in her marriage. She's not, she and John Stevens don't have any children. She doesn't ever get pregnant, and she's very aware of the fact that this is sort of like unacceptable socially. And so she's not like doing the things that a woman is supposed to do. She's not a happy wife. She's not becoming a mother. And so she, I think, doesn't want to press into this borderline womanly, unwomanly public role. But also, when she writes it, it's 1779. The revolution is still going on. There are other larger things happening in her world. And then also, in her own family circumstances, John Stevens, her husband, is a merchant. He loses a lot of money in the revolution because of the trade and embargoes and British taking down ships. So the timing is not right on a number of levels until later, in 1790, when things have sort of settled down. By that point, she is now happily married to her second husband. And although she still has not, become a mother, I think she feels more at ease with her own space as an older married woman, able to kind of speak without fear of pointing fingers, saying, well, this is not really appropriate.
Well, thank you for that introduction to Judith Sargent Murray, Sarah, and her motives in writing this, and why she withheld it from publication and used a pseudonym. That was a question we've just received as well. Cara, I'd like to ask you to give us some context on how this letter and the themes it expresses fits into the revolution. As Sarah pointed out, she does first draft it in the midst of the revolution. Could you offer some comparison to us to other key texts from the revolution, including the writings of the subject you study, Thomas Jefferson? Where do we see similarities and differences?
Oh, that's a great question. So, of course, my guy, Tommy J's Declaration of Independence asserts the equality of mankind. The way that it's phrased in the Declaration, all men are created equal. But I think there's a very strong case to be made that when Jefferson wrote that, he had in mind mankind, men, women, black, white. He was asserting a fundamental natural equality in terms of the rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And at the time that Jefferson was writing this document, he later on said that those ideas were just in the atmosphere, that he didn't come up with those ideas, they weren't his alone, but that they were everywhere across revolutionary colonies and revolutionary America, that many people were playing with these ideas and asserting their natural equality and their natural rights. And one of my favorite letters, which I'm sure a lot of our audience members will be familiar with, is right before Jefferson writes the Declaration, Abigail Adams writes to her husband, John Adams. She knows that he's on the verge of this, attempt to declare independence. And she writes to him and says, while you're doing this and while you're thinking about rights and creating a new government, remember the ladies, and starts this conversation with him about whether or not women's rights should be reconsidered in this revolutionary new government. And they go back and forth and have a very interesting exchange about whether a reformation of the law is necessary when it comes to women and women's rights. And nothing really ends up happening in that conversation, but I love that's going on around the same time as Judith Sargent Murray is starting to think about women's equality and play with some of the same ideas and assert women's equality in particular ways. And we can talk about what it is that she's wanting and what it is that she's arguing here in this document as we get into it in more detail.
Thank you, Cara. And as John just noted in the Q&A, John Adams was very dismissive of her assertion. And in that reply to her appeal, he dismisses women as unruly and lumps them in with children and people of African descent, the enslaved in America, and Native Americans as well. An early signal that the expansive notion of mankind that Jefferson seemed to have in mind would not be embedded within this document or the government that grows out of it. This brings me to a question I wanted to ask related to Abigail Adams' famous appeal. In that letter, she justifies the appeal by saying men skew toward tyranny. Men will be tyrants, I think is her exact phrase. And so she's making an essentialist argument. There's something unique about men's nature that leads them to be tyrants. Coming back to our document here, a question for both of you is this: how does Murray take on this embedded belief that by nature, men and women are essentially different? Early on in the letter, she speaks of the four features of the intellect: imagination, reason, memory, and judgment. And then she begins to argue that women by nature have great capacity for all four. How does she put that argument forward, and what language does she use to make it?
Cara, do you want to go first?
Sure. Can I take imagination? That's my favorite.
Yeah.
And then I'll let you take it over. She makes this fantastic argument for the province of imagination. And she bases it partly on fashion. And she has this little aside to her readers. She says to her readers, observe the variety of fashions. And then in parenthesis, here I bar the contemptuous smile. And then she continues, it's almost like she's saying, don't laugh at me. I know that y'all are not going to take this seriously, but look at the realm of fashion, which distinguishes and adorns the female world, and how continually fashion changes. It's almost enough to overturn I think she's referring to a scripture in Ecclesiastes where Solomon says that there's nothing new under the sun. And she says, well, look at fashion. There is something new under the sun, because, and in particular in the 1790s, women's fashion was undergoing a radical shift as a result of the revolution. And so she's showing us here very persuasively, she gives us some visual evidence of the capacities of women's brains to come up with new inventions. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Cara. Sarah?
And I'm so glad that you mentioned that bit, because I think it's really key to remember that at this point in history, and probably at all times in history, but especially in the late 1780s, 1790s, fashion is non-trivial. I mean, this is actually a really important part of the essay, because she's talking about something that later writers on gender will be very dismissive of. I mean, they will actually say, the reason we need women's education is so that women don't waste all their time on these frivolities, right? So by the 1820s, that's what you're going to have somebody like a Catherine Beecher, right? A reformer saying. But that's not the case now, because women are expressing their political alignment in the type of styles that they wear. So if they're more radical in their republicanism, they're going to wear more radically simplified fashions, right? Or if they're sympathetic to the French, they're going to, you know, wear the tricolore as the right? Yeah, exactly. So, and her readers would know all that. I mean, this is one of the things about reading a document. We say we want to just stick to the text, but you have to know kind of what you don't know, and then sort of think about that being added back in. And so we don't know that this is happening all around, but her readers do, right? So there is this added layer there. The other thing that I would say, David, is I think that she is, again, in this very much internal tension between the essentialist, she says, she appeals to this idea that like all men and women are both equally made in the image of God, right? And so that they share an essential human nature. And then also, well, that nature manifests itself differently in the male than the female, right? That there are tendencies. And then also wanting to very much point to the influence of culture on that, right? And so she, after this long passage on invention, she kind of passes over reason and memory very briefly. At the end of that long chunk, she says, "Are we deficient in reason? We can only reason from what we know, and if an opportunity of acquiring knowledge hath been denied us, the inferiority of our sex cannot be fairly deduced from that," right? So she says, we don't have enough evidence. Women's reason hasn't been given the same opportunity as man's reason, right? So she, I think, again, is very much ill at ease with making a clear statement. But she says, we know we share the same fundamental nature. And so give us the opportunity and let's see what happens, is underlying each of those four areas, I think.
Thank you both for that. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, if I could just add something else about this imagination section. I think she's very brave, because after she discusses the fashion issue, she turns to an accusation against women that they have this tendency to slander, to invent lies and to gossip about other people. And you would think that this would be kind of an arsenal of the men who are trying to argue against women's equality. She turns that around and says, yes, women are good at slandering, and they are good at inventing stories. And if they're caught in doing something wrong, give them a second. They'll come up with a great explanation as to why they were doing it. But this to her is just further evidence of great activity of mind. It's proof of a creative faculty, of a lively imagination. And the reason why this is going in a perverse direction is simply because of a lack of education. So something that would be part of the arsenal of the you are not equal, you are inferior, she manages to turn this the same way that she turns fashion into proof of imagination.
Yeah, thank you. That's a beautiful addition to what Sarah said, and we're focusing on the same part of the document here. I was struck in rereading this document for tonight's webinar, how carefully she constructs her arguments. She understands, she seems to anticipate that she will be assailed for being a woman, given to flights of fancy and frivolity and gossip, and that anticipating such a charge, she builds a pretty cogent argument, as Sarah pointed out, like, well, why is it that, and as you pointed out, why is it that women will gossip? Well, their minds are restless. They're not frivolous, right? I mean, they're looking for an intellectual outlet, and because of these restrictions, they turn to that. And then I love how she brings that elegantly back to imagination. Well, so that means they have one of those four powers as well. We've got a couple of questions that I'd like to pose now related to the reception of the document. So perhaps we could do that and then turn back to some of the messaging of the text itself. Heath asks, how was the essay received by the general public at the time? And Larissa asks, did Benjamin Rush's thoughts upon female education influence her decision to go public with this letter?
That's an interesting question that I don't know the answer to. I'm not aware of any specific reference that Murray ever made to Rush, but certainly she read widely, and I'm sure that would have come across her attention. So one thing that I did want to point out, Judith Sargent Murray wrote under a variety of pseudonyms during the course of her career, some of which were male. So the fact that she chooses to use Constantia here and to, she's writing pseudonymously, but pseudonymously as a woman is an interesting choice, right? On the one hand, it opens her up to a variety of criticism that she would not have experienced if she had written pseudonymously as a man. But on the other hand, it gives her a sort of insider's authority. She has been this woman who has not had the opportunity, quite literally. She has a younger brother named Winthrop Sargent, who is very non-academic. He is much more interested in sort of practical things, and he actually ends up going off to the Mississippi Territory later in life to help tame the wilderness. Like, that's what he wants to do. But he's the darling of the family as she's growing up. He's the one who has tutors for, ancient languages, and the one who's going to go to Harvard, and she doesn't get any of that, right? So she is writing from a very deeply personal experience of what it is to have your faculties sort of stunted. So all of which kind of goes back to this, why did it remain pseudonymous? I think because it is so personal, she doesn't want to write it under her own name. She, I think, would have felt like that exposed her family a little bit too much. But again, when we say pseudonymous, the people who she sent it to, the editors of the Massachusetts, that's not the name of it. What is it? The Massachusetts magazine. They knew, she sent it to them under her own name and asked that it be published as Constantia, right? It had been circulating in the educated elite circles where she had many, many friends. People knew who wrote it, but it wasn't published under her name. So, pseudonymous, but not really.
Sort of like George Kennan's Sources of Soviet Conduct, first published as Mr. X. It was widely known among the intelligentsia and the foreign policy elite who Mr. X was. And, that brings up an issue here, that her identity was widely known. Is that where her influence is felt? Because it's an open secret. Is that who is reading this? The educated elite? Would the Massachusetts magazine have reached beyond that? I mean, one thing we haven't talked about are literacy rates, which are, fairly low at this time. So when we talk about how the general public receives it, we can't think, well, everybody who picks up a newspaper would know what is in it, could read it even. So, wouldn't the impact be limited for that reason?
I'll talk a little bit about this in Massachusetts, and then maybe Cara, you can flesh out generally in the time period. Does that sound like a good division? Okay. So the Massachusetts magazine is the most popular periodical in Massachusetts in this time. And so, in terms of places she could have put the essay, this is the best place, right? It's going to hit the most readers. It has a fairly wide subscription base among the educated elite. And there's also the fact that those educated elites are, at this point in time, very much thinking about ways to reform, right? To continue the revolution after the war. And so the reception maybe be targeted to elites, but elites who are then going to try and put ideas into practice among a wider group. And so this specific essay, I know the question was, how was it received? And it was received fairly well at the time, because she's not like Mary Wollstonecraft, right, who she will later end up writing in defense of. She's not a radical, and she's trying to appeal to ideals that are still very much in vogue and untested. 1790 is right after, or not right after, but just a few years after the new Constitution has gone into effect. The United States are really the United States now. And she's writing at a time when there are still lots of possibilities for what that might mean for women, right? New Jersey actually allows women to vote in their revolutionary constitution until 1806, 1807. And she knows that, right? So she's not writing into a time period when things have completely closed down. And I will now turn it over to Cara.
Thank you, Sarah. Cara?
Yeah, I don't have very much to add to that as far as readership goes. I would say that it's of note that she is a woman writing from Massachusetts and not a woman writing from South Carolina or Virginia. I think that women, particularly in those regions, were less well educated. The Puritan background had more of an emphasis on reading and writing for boys and girls. But one other thing I did want to just mention is this issue of writing without putting your name on it. That was actually pretty common at the time. There was a different kind of culture around being the author of a document. And so Jefferson, for example, went to great pains to not come out publicly as the author of his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, but it was an open secret among all of the educated elites that he circulated his manuscript to and among all of his friends. Jane Austen didn't put her name on her books, even though eventually people did figure out who was writing them. So that to me adds an interesting detail that it could be a form of humility, if you will, to refrain and to write anonymously and to not want to put your name out there as a form of self-promotion that would have been culturally looked down upon.
Thank you for that, Cara. I mean, the Federalist Papers are an excellent example of that as well. I mean, it's part of the literary culture at the time. Presumably, if publishers had offered six-figure advances, people would have changed their minds about remaining pseudonymous.
But even Austen, I mean, Jane Austen pays for herself and her sister and her mother's livelihood, out of her advances for her later books, and she still doesn't publish them under her name, right? So
that's right. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Your great answers did give us a response to one of the questions we got. How familiar was she with Wollstonecraft, who published her Vindication 2 years later? As you noted, Sarah, she comes to her defense by defending her in print. Do we know if they were in correspondence with one another, or if Sergeant Murray was in correspondence with other notable women of the American Revolution? This is a question from Zachary.
So I'm pretty sure that they were not in correspondence with one another. However, she did write to other important women, right? So she's very much a person who is not afraid to sort of say, I know so-and-so who knows you, and, to then strike up a communication. And she's a very prolific letter writer, which they're not easily available, but you can get her letters and, dig into some of those connections.
Great, thank you. Returning to the text itself, I'd like to ask you both to comment on the issue she addresses. Again, I think this shows her anticipation of the likely denials, rebuttals, and rejections she'll get from male readers. She poses the question of, will education for women diminish their capacity to carry out domestic duties? And I paraphrase here, but I love her answer, which is essentially, yes, we can stitch a seam and think too. It actually offers an opportunity to develop the mind. And I'll tack on to that this question from Catherine. Did she get the education she was looking for? And just to touch back to a point Sarah raised, she does mention a proverbial brother, right? There are two references to that. As their years increase, the sister must be wholly domesticated while the brother is led by the hand through all the flowery paths of science. That definitely seems to be a reference to her specific situation.
Well, I don't know which part of that to answer first, because you raised so many interesting things
Sorry.
there. Maybe did she get any type of education offered to her? She was self-educated, so she was taught the basics, but then her father made their family library accessible to her. And because she was from a fairly wealthy family in Massachusetts, they had a pretty good library. And so she taught herself history and philosophy. But I love this passage that you just mentioned. She gives the example of judgment. Are men's and women's judgment equal? And her answer to this is, well, look at a 2-year-old boy and a 2-year-old girl. Is the 2-year-old boy exhibiting better judgment than the 2-year-old girl? And I think that she implies the reverse. No, she doesn't imply. She says the reverse is generally observed to be true. The difference occurs because of partiality. How is the one exalted and the other depressed by the contrary modes of education which are adopted? The one is taught to aspire and the other is early confined and limited. As the years increase, the sister is wholly domesticated while the brother is led by the hand through all the flowery paths of science. And you're right, that does seem like a very personal example, that she might be thinking about her own brother being ushered into the gateways of learning while she is relegated to doing these domestic tasks that she seems to say are quite easily mastered. It's not rocket science learning how to cook a stew and sew a stitch. Sarah, what do you think?
No, I would absolutely agree with that. And the only thing I would add is her parents have money. Then when she leaves her father's house to go marry John Stevens, she kind of thinks that she's going to still have money, but it turns out he's not a very good merchant. He makes bad investments. And so they end up living well below what she thought. And so she has to be very parsimonious. She has to cut back to the bare minimum of servants. And, I know we're all thinking, oh, poor little rich girl. But she writes quite a lot about how it pains her to have to invest time in all these daily household chores, because it means she can't be the woman of leisure, investing in her own education that she expected because of her class and background to be able to be. And when she is able to, when she's able to get her finances in order, she then she makes a habit of secreting herself in, a private closet and spending quite a lot of time with her books. And, that's a big part of her order of life, is to invest that time when she can, have the kind of help that makes that time possible.
Thank you, Sarah. The next question I'd like to ask concerns her rhetorical skill. We've discussed how she puts forward very strong arguments and reasons from deduction. She also is skillful in the use of humor. And one prominent example to me, and it also fits in with her deductive reasoning, she says, I know there are those who assert that as the animal power of the one sex are superior, of course, their mental faculties also must be stronger, thus attributing strength of mind to the transient organization of this earth-born tenement. This, of course, a reference to men's argument that the physical strength many of them are endowed with gives them a natural superiority. She goes on to then say, if this reasoning is just, man must be content to yield the palm to many of the brute creation, since by not a few of his brethren of the field, he's far surpassed in bodily strength. And I just love the subtlety of the humor there. So if you're not as strong as an ox, are you therefore not as smart as an ox by this logic? Are there other examples of her use of humor or irony? And could you comment on its effectiveness as a rhetorical strategy? Was this common in publications like this at the time?
Sarah, do you want to take this one first?
Sure. So, I mean, I mean, even in the next paragraph, David, I am aware that there are many passages in the sacred oracles which seem to give the advantage to the other sex, but I consider all these as wholly metaphorical. I mean, this isn't, it's not what we would consider humor, right? But in the context of the 1790s, the fact that she's sort of, David is a man after God's own heart, yet see him enervated by his licentious, it's like, it's a very wry sort of like, okay, we all know the story, right? Like, is this really what makes men better? Because they're doing these things. I think that she also, again, I don't know if it's humor, but she uses a similar sort of gentle appeal to the reader in the passage after the bit about the brother, when she's talking about how it's in men's interest for women to be better educated because they'll be better wives, right? Because if they marry men who are smarter than them and they have been denied all these things, then they're not going to be able to enjoy a companionate marriage, right? They're not going to be able to enjoy a conversation. And if worse, if they marry men who are not as smart as they are, then they're going to despise their husbands and all these things. So I think that, again, it's not really humor, but it kind of is. I mean, it kind of is appealing to the reader's situation and sort of empathy for, oh yeah, I wouldn't want to be married to somebody who I couldn't talk to, that would be awful. And it is very effective. And it's, I think, common in other female authors at the time. I don't know that I necessarily can think of a male writer who does this quite as much, but it's something a lot of female writers do.
It almost reminds me of John's response to Abigail Adams when Abigail says, remember the ladies and your sex are so naturally tyrannical. And John writes back and says, your letter made me laugh. And we have been told while we're here, in Philadelphia, that what we're doing is upsetting the natural order and the natural hierarchy, and that Indians are going to be rebelling and children won't go to school and all of these things will happen. And it comes across now as offensive and dismissive. But I think it's also John attempting to be witty and humorous and say, kind of avoid a controversy with his wife by saying, well, we're being accused of turning the whole world upside down, and now you're telling me that women are rebelling as well. And I think that it's the same sort of dry wit that we're seeing here with Judith Sargent Murray, except now maybe it's a little bit more effective because she's putting reasoned arguments behind her wit and her humor, so that the logic has this nice icing on it. Whereas John Adams just uses his humor to just avoid dealing with a problem.
Great, thank you both for that commentary. Let's next discuss her religious references. It strikes me that she has a very interesting rendering of the fall and the story of creation. The way she presents Eve and her motives, and the way she presents the actions of Adam as told in Genesis, probably bewildered a lot of readers, because it's not the traditional telling, and she bends it back toward her argument that women are endowed with the same natural gifts as men. Could you offer some thoughts on how she presents the fall and how it supports her larger argument for the equality of the sexes?
Cara, I feel like I've been going first a lot. Do you want to go?
Sure. It sounds as though she's been in conversation with a male. And so the passage that you're referring to, she starts out by saying that she's going to quote from a letter where she replies to a male correspondent. And the male correspondent had argued, well, Eve sinned first, and therefore women are weaker. And that's proof. And so she provides this narrative of the Genesis account where she argues, let me turn to the right section here. She argues that actually Eve had a noble motivation for listening to the serpent or the angel, as Sargent Murray puts it, that she is offered knowledge And why wouldn't she want to take that knowledge? So the quotation here, it does not appear that she was governed by anyone's sensual appetite, but merely by a desire of adorning her mind. A laudable ambition fired her soul, and a thirst for knowledge impelled the predilection so fatal in its consequences. And then she goes even a step further to say, not only did Eve have a laudable goal to just achieve knowledge through eating the apple, but Adam saw his wife affected by that original sin and still ate the apple himself, which to Sergeant Murray is then evidence that, as she puts it, blush, ye vaunters of fortitude, ye boasters of revolution, you people who think that men are better than women naturally, you haughty lords of the creation, blush when you remember he was influenced by no other motive than a bare pusillanimous. Sarah, you can correct my pronunciation of that word. Attachment to a woman by sentiments so exquisitely soft that all his sons have from this period when they designed to degrade them described as highly feminine. So she completely turns the story on its head and gives Eve a noble motive and Adam a base sensual motive. She's not necessarily denying that Eve was wrong in what she did, but her telling of the story, I have several questions about it. And it made me go back to Genesis and reread this story. And one thing I wish that I could argue with Sergeant Murray is, I don't know that the Genesis account tells us that Eve experiences the effects of sin until after Adam has also eaten the apple. So both of them at the same time become conscious of their nakedness. And that would maybe hurt Sergeant Murray's version of the story a bit. But Sarah, what do you make of this? And how should I have pronounced that word?
No, one of the wonderful things about being a scholar of these, texts is these words that are unpronounceable, right? And writing about them so you don't have to say them out loud. And then we come to talk to the people and we say, shoot. Yeah, it's a terrible, terrible word. So here's the interesting thing. Judith Sargent Murray's first publication, which actually is, under her own name, is a catechism for children and in the Universalist faith. So in the 1770s, John Murray, who is from England, comes to Gloucester, Massachusetts, and starts preaching, universal salvation, a version of Christianity which denies basically original sin, that denies that men are inherently, tainted by the fall, and then also teaches that Murray's version of universalism is not as far from Christianity as universalism will later become. He still is talking about the atonement and the death of Christ as salvific, but as salvific for all humankind, right? He teaches that salvation is God's plan for all humanity, and kind of a much more, love and peace and harmony version of the story than, judgment and wrath and all of that, which appeals to Judith Sargent very, very much. And she and her family all become founding members of what becomes the first Universalist congregation in the United States. And then, like I said, she writes this catechism that gets used to educate, like Sunday school, type stuff. So I think that that's important to keep in mind when we're looking at her version of the fall. Eve is wrong, but not really, she desires something good, right? Like she's disobeying God, but because she desires something good, not because of her pride, which is what, a more classical Calvinist would have said. So I think that's an interesting part of this, right? It's not just that Eve is elevated over, kind of medieval depictions of the fall, but also that the fall isn't really as bad as sort of traditional Orthodox Christian doctrines would have made it. And so we can say that Eve's motives are not not blameworthy, because the consequences are not as disastrous.
Thank you, Sarah. We got a question from Kim that I think fits into this discussion nicely. Kim wondered if there was evidence she had read Paradise Lost. Thinking above and beyond that specific text, you mentioned, Sarah, earlier that her father allowed her access to his library, and so she educated herself. So whether she read Paradise Lost or not, she's absorbing these texts, and they are providing a basis for what she's arguing here, and providing her with knowledge to do so. What type of education did she envision? To make another comparison to Wollstonecraft, I mean, she really goes after the present education system and says it's awful. It's producing little tyrants. Sort of building off Abigail Adam. Look at what happens to boys when they go off to school. We can do so much better than that. Did Sergeant Murray ever articulate what she envisioned for the education of girls and women? Did she want coeducational education, a separate curriculum, the same type of texts to be read?
So this is a great question. And for the most complete treatment of it, I would really point people to Sheila Skemp's biography of Judith Sargent Murray, which is excellent. And I'm forgetting the title of it at the moment, but basically if you Google Sheila Skemp and Judith Sargent Murray together, it'll come up, because it's really central to Skemp's story about Judith Sargent Murray's life, the sort of development of her thoughts on education. And she does not have a particular treatise, right? There's no document you can go to where she has, here's my plan for what female education should look like. But she does have many, many, letters that she writes to that brother, who's so much younger than she is, that she actually serves as kind of a mother figure to him, and kind of says, oh, here's what you should be reading next, or, are you working with your tutor on that, right? And so we can glean from those letters what she thinks is important. She acts as the common at the time for family members to send their daughters to live with other, aunts and uncles, to be sort of finished in lieu of a formal, institutional schooling. So she serves in that capacity for various younger female relatives, and we can look at, what she asked them to do. The most long-lived of those relationships gets very, very tense, because the young lady to whom she is, setting forth all these agenda items really has none of the inclinations to them. And so, Judith Sargent Murray is kind of trying to replicate a classical, great text and dead languages, like Harvard at home kind of thing. And the young lady has no interest whatsoever. So they're continually butting heads. With her own daughter, Julia Maria, she kind of eases off a little bit because of that bad experience. And so she is more concerned about keeping the relationship and paying attention to the individual inclinations, and less about ideals. But again, like you can see this whole story in this wonderful biography that Sheila Skemp has given, and see how her views mature as she gains more experience as an educator.
Thank you, Sarah.
And just to ask another follow-up question, doesn't she also help start a girls' academy later on with a couple of her cousins that she aids in opening the school for girls?
Yes, I think that's right. I had forgotten about that, but yeah.
Building off this idea of proper education and bringing girls and women into the educational experience, we know that she became a proponent of Republican motherhood. Could I ask you both to comment on what Republican motherhood meant, and how this letter sets up advocacy of Republican motherhood? And was Republican motherhood at odds with an equal opportunity for education for women? And maybe, Cara, we could start with you.
A good question. Why don't I talk about what women didn't have. And then Sarah, you can talk about what changed. So in order to understand the historical context in which Judith Sargent Murray is writing, you have to understand a legal system called coverture. This goes back to English common law. And the way that I like to explain it or think about it is there's a verse in the Bible that says, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and become one with his wife. And the reason is marriage. It's a beautiful romantic verse, but English common law took that verse and rather literally interpreted that once a woman became married, she no longer had any legal identity of her own. There were one person, and that person was the man. So a woman could not legally own property. She could not sign contracts. She could not sue or be sued. She had no right to the custody of her own children. And so this legal system was inherited by the British colonies. And that's when Abigail Adams writes her letter to John Adams and says, do not put so much power in the hands of the husbands. That's the world that she is living in, a world in which an abusive husband quite literally does have almost all of the power over his wife. He couldn't murder his wife, but there were even instances in which physical violence was acceptable. Rape within marriage was not illegal until the 1980s, I believe, in the United States. So coverture is this legal system that deprived women of rights and of equality, and education is just one more facet of what women are being deprived because they are seen as legally subsumed in the identity, first of their fathers and then of their husbands. So the revolution changes things in a rather drastic way, because now there are opportunities for women to become politically active. In fact, men appeal to women to become politically active and want women to do things like petition or boycott and refuse to buy tea, harm the British economy, support the war effort, become nurses. So women leave their domestic spheres for a period of time and become politically engaged and are supported in that in some ways by the society and in other ways just by necessity because their husbands are all off at war. And then the question becomes, after the revolution, what is the new regime going to do for women? Are women's roles in society going to change permanently, or are they going to go back to the completely domesticated sphere that they were inhabiting before the revolution? Okay, and I will stop talking and let Sarah tell her.
Excellent. So yes, we're at this moment when the idea of everyone has to be committed to the regime is also deeply in the air. Somebody asked about Benjamin Rush's writings about public education earlier, and Rush is very much a proponent of the fact that the model for successful republics is in the ancient world, right? Unlike most of the founding fathers, though, he doesn't point to Athens or Rome, he points to Sparta. And he is very convinced that the Spartan mothers were essential to the success of that city-state, right? It was the mothers who raised their little boys to know that they belonged to the polis, and gave them that fortitude. And he thinks that that's going to be critical for American success, that American mothers have to inculcate these Republican virtues in their children from a very young age. But in order for that to happen, then the mothers have to have those virtues, right? So they have to have a baseline education and sort of sense of buy-in to the regime. So that's the idea of Republican motherhood, right? That your moms are your first teachers, and they're the ones who get their children to be formed into good little, future citizens at the most basic level. And so it requires a certain degree of public education or public facing education for women, even if it's conducted in private settings, and a certain recognition of women's capacities and also they're not just domestic responsibilities, but in a domestic setting, right? And this moment, 1790, is sort of, it could have gone in so many directions. It could have become much more egalitarian, or even complementarian, right? In the sense that you could have had men and women seen as different, but as equal despite, the differences. And then we know that as we move into the 19th century, and especially as industrialization takes men's work more and more out and away from the home, the separation of the spheres gets wider and wider, and the motherhood part becomes much more narrowly defined. So this moment, I think, is really interesting because it's right at the hinge of that transition.
Thank you, Sarah and Cara. I mean, your wonderful answers remind us of the past that could have been taken. And certainly when we do look at what did happen, we're getting an ever greater sense of how involved in revolutionary rhetoric and the revolution itself women are. I mean, it's easy to focus on the Adams's exchange and walk away with, well, the men, thought about it for a second and said no. So women weren't a part of the revolution, but they are, as you pointed out, Cara, there's in the air this revolutionary rhetoric, and Jefferson really and ideals, and Jefferson feels like he's channeling that. Well, it's being channeled by Sergeant Murray and Wollstonecraft and Abigail Adams, and becomes essential to the survival of the experiment in liberty. And we see it in other women's statements too. We have this wonderful reminder from Cheryl of Sojourner Truth's observation in 1851. Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. It's easy to imagine that as a comment given to this description of the fall, this rendering of the fall that Sergeant Murray provides. In our closing minutes, I'd like, if I may, to circle back to context and ask you both for some thoughts and suggestions on other sources that could be used in conjunction with this one to introduce students to this underappreciated but so vital part of the history of the revolution, how women contributed to it, how their intellectual development was shaped by it.
I bet Sarah is going to have fantastic. She literally wrote the book on this.
What else should we read from Gender and Equality, Sarah? That's what I should just ask directly.
Yep, there you go.
All right.
She has an amazing edited collection for us.
Do you want to add something before I?
Well, I wanted to just ask, do you have Abigail Adams' letters to her uncle? I think his name was John Thaxter. Do you include that in the book? Because that's
those would have been great.
Those are fun. I have a document collection that starts with the Remember the Ladies letter, but then it includes Abigail Adams telling that story to her friend Mercy Otis Warren, and then discussing women's rights with her uncle, and she and her uncle have a great exchange about voting and women's rights. So that would be my only suggestion on the topic. But what else should we be reading, Sarah?
That would be an excellent addition. So in the edited volume, the two documents that precede this one that I think would be great are the Edenton Ladies Agreement, which is from October 27th, 1774. This is a group of women actually from either North or South Carolina, I'm not remembering now, but from the South. So it's interesting because they're not Puritan stock. But they grouped together and agreed to boycott British goods, and so they're taking action politically, and then they write down this statement, and it actually is published in a British newspaper, and because the British are so sort of like, oh my gosh, even the women in the colonies have gone mad, right? Like, this is just crazy. And then Esther Reed, The Sentiments of an American Woman from January 1780. She's a Philadelphia matron, incredibly influential behind the scenes. She hosts all these wonderful salon type dinner parties in Philadelphia throughout the Revolutionary period. In Washington's letters around the time between the first administration and the second administration later, he will talk about being at Mrs. Reed's house and having her ask him if he's going to run again, and how she convinced him, right? Like, he gives her credit for convincing him to take a second term as president. So she's a really big deal. During the revolution, she tries to raise money for the soldiers, and then she publishes this broadside, where she appeals to all the patriotic women of Philadelphia. And so like that's a really great example of women who are being active in politics, right? And engaging in civic life. They don't have formal rights, they don't have legal standing, but they are doing all of these things and kind of claiming rights on their own through their actions and their words. Much as, you know, we sometimes talk about self-emancipated slaves, right? When we talk about runaway slaves, it's almost the self-emancipation of women in this period.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, I mean, so often the story begins in 1848 in Seneca Falls, but as this wonderful hour has shown us, the story begins much earlier. Thank you to Dr. Cara Rogers and Dr. Sarah Morgan-Smith for introducing us to and telling us so much more about this text. Participants will receive an email with a certificate worth 2 hours of continuing education time. There'll also be a link to our archives. You can find this webinar and all others on our YouTube channel and our podcast. Remember that December 15th, Wednesday, December 15th, will feature Dr. Joe Fornieri talking about free speech from that collection. Thanks to Jeremy Gipton, our coordinator, and thanks to all participants for your attention and engagement.
Thanks again for listening. You can learn more about our free programs, resources, and documents collections at teachingamericanhistory.org or tah.org.